What do you do when a longtime employee, someone that you feel loyal to, they're loyal to you, they're trusted, maybe you care about them deeply, but they're clearly no longer the right fit for your company? Few decisions are harder for a business owner. If you handle it poorly, you risk resentment and cultural damage. If you handle it well, you protect the company's future while honoring that employee's contribution. Now, before I begin getting too deeply into this, you want to make sure that any decision you make regarding letting somebody go is aligned with labor law, with HR policies, and any employment contracts that you might have. I'm not offering legal advice. This is about leading people well while making necessary strategic decisions. By the end of this video, you'll know when and how to let go of a long-term employee without triggering fear, gossip, or cultural drift, and how to keep your top performers from disengaging when misalignment goes unaddressed. The decision to let a long-term employee go, in my experience, is really one of the most difficult decisions that a business leader makes. Contrary to what you see in the news or you hear about in movies, most leaders of companies lose an enormous amount of sleep over having to deal with employees that are actually no longer working in the company and are actually, as a result, doing some kind of damage. They're not serving customers or clients well. They're somehow pulling the company down in a particular way. They know and they understand that people's mortgages are tied to their pay, that there's families that they're taking care of, that there's, it's a difficult scenario and a difficult decision. So if you're in that place, that doesn't mean just because it's difficult that it's not a decision that needs to be addressed and may need to be made. And so I want to try to help make it easier for you, at least in understanding how to approach this. One of the things that can help, let me grab a marker here. One of the things that can help is understanding what actually happened in the situation. And this impacts how you address the employee, particularly with companies that are growing quickly or going through some significant transition. Oftentimes there's misinterpretation about what's happening with your employee who's no longer performing the way that you hoped for or expected. And the first thing is perhaps the company changed. This is common, maybe one of the most common scenarios. The company changed in some way. It grew, it's pursuing a different strategy, it has a different product or service mix. Something changed, and the key employee that you had in that position and the job that they were hired for and the understanding that they had when they came to you, either when they were hired or promoted, that's actually fundamentally changed. And they no longer actually find themselves coming to work each day and doing the thing that they were signed up for. There's now a lot of other things or different things on their plate than what they originally came to. And so you want to recognize maybe the employee hasn't changed at all. Maybe they're still performing that same level of service or same quality of service that they did 15 or 20 years ago, but the company has changed around them and they haven't, either due to skill or due to desire or whatever, they haven't adapted to that change. And if that hasn't been identified and addressed, it can lead to a misunderstanding or it can change the approach for how you try to resolve this, but also what you need to do about it. The second is sometimes the person has changed. Sometimes there's a health issue, sometimes there's a family issue, sometimes they get burned out, sometimes they lose interest in this kind of job or this kind of role. Sometimes people's skills plateau or actually in certain fields where you have to keep maintaining and growing your skills to keep up, they don't keep doing that for any reason. Oftentimes there's some kind of a dynamic like this, and it's helpful to evaluate who changed here. Did this person stop showing up and delivering the way they needed to for that job? Or did the company itself or the role change? And in understanding that and defining that, it can help you strategize how to relate to it more effectively. Because what tends to happen many times is the company changes and we blame the person for that dynamic. And if the reality is the demands on the position are different than what they signed up for, we can take ownership for that in a different kind of a way than if the person has just stopped performing in some way. Part of the other background behind this that's important to understand is that oftentimes when leaders are considering the need to let somebody go, they're very, very focused on the discomfort of that conversation. And they tend to not think about the broader impact. As surprising as that may seem to employees, that's often neglected and not considered. And so usually if you have an underperformer on a team, it's kind of an open secret. Everybody usually knows this person's not performing as well as they could or should, because they're often having to carry that person's weight, or they're having to find workarounds for them, or they're fixing their mistakes. There's something like that going on. And oftentimes it's the most senior leaders who seem to be the last to discover that there's an issue, and the sense can often be that they're delaying doing something about it. And unfortunately, these delays oftentimes take years, is what I've observed, is that they'll tolerate underperformance in a key role for a very long time because of a history with an individual. And as a result, you can actually lose some very high performers on your team. The other things that happen is that other high performers watch this dynamic with this individual who's changed, where there's been a change, whatever it is, and they're not performing to where they were at. And if they see it being tolerated, they either, if they're not intrinsically motivated towards high performance, may drop their performance to match what to them may be signaled as a status quo, or they'll start to, because most high performers like to work at places where high performance is desired and wanted and rewarded, they actually become more susceptible to being poached by competition and moving to other places. And if you're not thinking about that, then you are deluding yourself. There's really no other way to say it. Particularly in this hiring market, high performers want to work with other high performers. And if you don't have a team that's all pulling weight together, it can create resentment inside of that. And that opens up your team to being poached by outsiders. The other part of it is even people who are allies or friends of this low performer, they can develop compassion fatigue over time. They care about the person, they like going to barbecues with the person, they've gone to their kids' birthday parties, all of those things. But over time, they get tired of covering for the person, working around the person, or carrying their weight, fixing their mistakes. And that can just provide a drag on them as well. And it's something that never shows up in your profit and loss. It's something that you don't obviously see impacting your profit line. It doesn't seem to show up obviously with competition, but it's impacting all of it significantly. I was working with one company years ago that had one of these people that had been with the company for decades. He was went on the senior management team, senior executive team, and he was viewed as very smart and very competent, but he was a toxic. He wasn't just an underperformer, he was a toxic employee. Now, he didn't seem that way to the ownership team or the other leaders, but he did to employees. And what happened is when it was finally addressed, a couple of interesting things happened. One is they discovered a significant amount of mismanagement of funds and theft under the individual. And unfortunately, that's more common than you might think when you have toxic employees, is they're often not as loyal to you as you have felt towards them. The other part of it is a significant number of people who had left the company when they realized that person had been let go. They came back and they said, now that that person's gone, we would love to come back and work with you again. And this whole staff problem that they had with filling roles was alleviated because people just started coming back to them because they really wanted to work with the company. They just couldn't tolerate that individual anymore. And so I've seen that kind of dynamic happen many, many times. And it's because of actually that incident that I'm describing right now that I began to recognize you have to be quicker about moving or addressing underperformance with long-term employees than what most leaders feel comfortable doing. The last thought on this point right here is that the teams are not just judging this individual or looking at the individual's performance. They're also evaluating your performance as a leader based off of how do you handle a problem situation? Do we tolerate problems here, or do we find constructive ways to address them? And they're watching you for that. And as you model ways of addressing uncomfortable, difficult situations in a way that maintains respect and care for people, you begin to, or you don't model it, whatever happens, that begins to shape the culture of the organization. The next step that I want you to consider here is a diagnostic step. And broadly speaking, are we talking about misconduct with this individual, or are we talking about a performance issue? It might be both, but oftentimes we're talking about one or the other. And if they're a long-term employee and they've been there for a while, sometimes this is difficult to recognize because it seems to like skirt up to the edges of things frequently, but not overtly cross the lines, or at least in a way that you can easily see. And so if you have an issue here where there's misconduct and part of this person, this could be a harassment, a safety violation, an ethical breach, or dishonesty in some kind of way, this is just somebody that needs to be transitioned out. That needs to happen quickly, as expeditiously as possible. It's someone that has broken trust with the organization, and it is now dangerous to keep them there. Oftentimes, when you find those issues and they come to light, not always, but oftentimes, and this is why you do want to do an investigation around this and explore things, but oftentimes you'll find that it's a tip of an iceberg and there's a lot more going on underneath that you weren't aware of. On the other hand, if you have a performance issue, in other words, the role that they're in no longer fits them well and there's a gap, you want to begin to find a way to address that. And so the first thing, or the concept that I like around this is a rehiring. It's called rehiring. And the question you ask yourself is if this particular role were open today, would I hire that person to fill that job? And if your answer is no, then you need to figure out and you need to take action on what you're going to do about that. The first approach to take is to help call them up to the performance. I often call this a why in the road, but I'll maybe call it a fork in the road in this way. And you have essentially three options, is where you challenge them to step up to the level of performance that's needed, whatever that is. And if they're unable or unwilling to within a defined amount of time, within a time frame that makes sense for the company's performance, then this is not a fit for them. They're choosing which path they want to take. This is assuming there's not misconduct, but they're just not getting the job done in the right way. The second thing is you place them into a position where there's fit. And so if they're, for example, what often happens is the Peter Principle dynamic, where somebody gets promoted to their level of incompetence. In other words, they were good technically, promoted into management, and then management's not what they're good at. And then you feel like you're stuck with them. And so either you give them an option to, be coached or get training and to make some changes to step into the management role that's needed, or you'll move them into a job that's a better fit for what their actual performance interests and capacities are at. The last thing is they need to move on. And so they get this range of choices that you can offer them if you have a performance issue. And I find that this is usually the best way to help negotiate with them and essentially rehire them. And so in this conversation, I like to have very short, you might have a performance improvement plan or whatever you want to call it, but it should be very quick and there should be a very fast change because you're working with a grown-up adult. And if the issue is not showing up on time, not getting reports done, not being thorough, not being accurate, they either can quickly make the changes or they won't, or they aren't able to. Either way, it should be pretty obvious pretty fast that they're going to step up or they're not. And so it doesn't take 90 days to track and see if they're going to step up. You should see the step up essentially immediately, and they should mostly maintain it. People may have little slipbacks periodically, but they should maintain whatever it is that if they are stepping up, they should be able to maintain that. Now, with the rehiring idea, what you're doing is you're saying, look, we need to kind of hit a reset on our position. You're valuable here. We appreciate your long-term history, but where performance is no longer matching the needs for this position. And so here's specifically, and I like very specific expectations about what stepping up will look like and how it'll be measured and evaluated. So you know and they know precisely what you'll look at to know if they've stepped up. So this is what I'm looking for. Is this something you want? Is that an opportunity? And if they say, no, that's not a good fit for me, then say, great. The second option is let's move you to a place, this is assuming they still have a place where there's a good fit for them, of a level of responsibility or technical demand that fits where your sweet spot is and where you're really good. Let's move you there. Will you accept that position? And if they say no, then the alternative is, all right, well, we can still be friends. We can still know each other. We really appreciate your time and your history here. But I think maybe we need to help find you a place elsewhere that's a better fit for you, because we don't have a place that fits right now. Whether it's the company's changed, I guess I erased that. Whether it's the company changed or they've changed, the fit has now changed, and we need to figure out how to address that. If you don't, there's a high cost to inaction. What happens with this is, as I said earlier, high performers, actually everybody watches this stuff mostly, and it's more, in my work throughout organizations, usually teams have a clearer sense of performance of their peers than often what supervisors have. That's not always true, but it's often true. And if you don't address it, you can damage morale across that team or across that company. High performers will often begin to disengage. You send mixed signals into your culture, and you no longer have a clear through line of what really is important in terms of performance. And people understand that some people can kind of get away with things here. And decision-making across the company slows. So allowing one employee's misalignment, it begins to dictate the standards of the company, and you don't want to do that. At that point, avoiding that issue or not addressing it conclusively starts to turn into a tail wagging the dog type issue where whole company direction and strategy is allowed to suffer or be impacted because of discomfort in dealing with a single confrontation, really, a healthy confrontation. Okay, the second part of this is if you've decided or this person's decided, no, I don't want to step up. No, actually, I don't want to move to a position that fits me. I guess I need to move on. Or maybe they're not as saying that, but they're not moving into a position that fits them or performing or stepping up. Then termination is the unfortunate option that's left to you. I've seen how avoiding this difficult conversation can damage a business and actually damage relationships. That's why I've built resources on my website, christianmuntean.com, that are specifically designed to give you a clear path forward when you're dealing with conflict or difficult decisions. That's the next logical step for you to go to help ensure that your company is aligned for future growth. The link to my website is in the video description. And if you're getting value from this video, please take a second to like and subscribe. YouTube loves this. It helps other owners find content like this. There's some approaches to this. One is I try to do this in a way, or I would encourage doing this in a way that's as affirming as possible. It's always going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be a hard conversation most of the time. Here's part of the consideration though. Most of the time, they recognize they're not performing the job the way they ought to. And they don't feel good about that either. That's generally the case. It's not that often that somebody's completely surprised that they weren't doing a great job at their job. Usually they kind of have a suspicion that there's something that what I'm doing and what's expected is not right. So when you come and talk to them about it, it typically confirms to them what they already knew. Now, whether or not they're being honest with themselves about it is a different thing. But part of what you want to do is, or the principles around this is, I don't think there should be surprises. So if somebody's going to be let go, they should understand they had options to improve things and they chose not to take those options. Or maybe they tried in some way, but they weren't able to deliver. And so that's why you want to have very clear metrics that define success if they step up, and very clear metrics that define success if they move to a position where there's a new fit. But what will success look like and be measured by in those roles? And so if they're not hitting those metrics, you should be able to go to them, and it's very clear to you and to them that this wasn't working. So that's one of the first things, is you want there to be a no surprises type scenario. This is just good leadership because it's bringing a coaching and mentoring element into your leadership, as opposed to avoiding talking to someone for a year, watching their performance decline, blaming them entirely, not giving them any coaching or mentoring, or letting them know that performance isn't working well because you're uncomfortable with the issue. That's a leadership problem. And so you need to give them a little bit of time to correct if you haven't brought this up before. The second thing that's often important is to make sure that there is clear documentation around this. This gets into HR and legal issues, which I'm not an expert in, but it is helpful to make sure that you've identified, well, you just want to stay in compliance with whatever the relevant policies and law is for your scenario. But it is helpful if there's documentation clearly about the defined expectations, their acceptance of those expectations, and then what actually happens in performance, and how your decision about their future with the company or separate from the company is determined by their ability to or not to match that performance. A few things about separation processes that can make it more strategic and humane, so you're still caring for the person, is to have a severance package that's appropriate for their tenure and their contribution in the company. So help give them a soft landing or a transition to where they're going to go. You might frame the exit, and this is only if it's honest, you might frame the exit as the company grew or changed. They were still doing what they were originally hired to do 15 years ago, but the company has changed and grown beyond that, and there's no longer the same fit that there used to be, and they're now moving on to a place where there's fit. What I like to do is make sure that as much as is honest and as is possible, you're describing your reasoning or your rationale for the change objectively to the performance standards, not to issues that are squishy about their character or their personality or things like that. That can, or their identity or any of those kinds of dynamics, because A, it's not helpful because they can't correct it or they can't use that information to find a better fit for themselves in another job. And it's just hurtful in some way. And they'll either shut down and not hear it anyways, or it's just going to take an already often difficult conversation and make it that much more painful. The last thing that you're wanting to do, or almost the last thing that you're wanting to do, is to think about the cultural dynamics and how this change is going to be communicated to the team. And so if they stay, we've got these options of stepping up, finding a place where there's fit, or move on, I think I called it. So these three options here. If they decide not to step up into the role and you move them to a place where there's fit, you want to frame that to the team as a strategic alignment. You don't want to say Bob was doing a bad job at their role, so we're moving him to a place to see if it's going to work. That's disparaging to Bob. It doesn't give anyone else confidence in what's going on. They shouldn't move into this position unless they can perform at that role. You want to find a place where they can be successful. And so if that is what you're doing, you want to say, look, the position changed. The company changed, conditions changed. There's, things going on in Bob's life, and this is a better fit. And we and Bob sat down and talked, and this is a better position for him. And it's a place where he can contribute to the company in a way that feels good to him and feels good to us. And so that kind of a reframing can be helpful for the individual and for others because it still helps retain that person's dignity in place. And the other thing you want to do with this is you want to clarify what their focus is going to be and what their contribution is going to be in that role. Now, if they move on, you want to say simply, and you keep very objective and you don't say much about this generally, and this is really mostly to people that need to know what's actually happening. But you're going to say, Bob's moving on to new opportunities, and here's how the responsibilities are going to be covered. And you can just broadly say that this is just about realigning this individual's roles. This isn't about major restructuring or not going through the whole company and kicking people out of jobs or moving roles. This is not a sign of broader layoffs. This is a single event that's happening to help Bob find a place that fits him the best. And he's decided to move on to this other opportunity. And that's really all that can or needs to be said. Remembering most people on the team will already know Bob's performance and that he wasn't performing at this level. They'll usually understand what's going on. If you do this in a way that doesn't fabricate information, doesn't blame Bob or dehumanize him in any way, then that usually is sufficient for most people. I would not comment on Bob's motives. I wouldn't comment on the level of effort or any perception of attitude or anything else. I would not bring up any dirty laundry about Bob at all, ever. I would just say Bob's moving on. Here's what typically happens afterwards. The team experiences a sense of relief. They usually recognize Bob wasn't carrying the load that the leadership hoped that Bob would carry, or whoever you're talking about. And so morale will often improve, surprisingly, because they've all felt this. Even if they knew and liked Bob, they recognize there was a problem there. And then if you bring in somebody who is a right fit, who can step up for that role, then that often is like, great, we needed somebody in that role who could perform, who could provide lift, and now we're finally getting that. So here's the basic idea. Honor the history of the person that you're letting go. So if they have years of great history, say, man, we really appreciate this. You help lay a foundation here. You help really carry us through some good times. It's clear we want to find a place, or that the company's changed and there's no longer the same kind of fit, but you want to honor the contributions that they've made. Don't make the events, if it's just purely a performance and not some kind of a misconduct issue, don't make the events about how their history with you ends a definition of their entire relationship with you. There's a concept, I can't remember, see if I can find who said it. Reid Hoffman, who's a leader in the tech space. A lot of the major companies in tech, Reid Hoffman's been involved with it, either founding them or being on their boards of PayPal and Facebook and so on. He has this concept of tour of duty, that people come and work with you for a period. It's military language of coming and working on a mission for a period of time and then moving on to something else. And so it's that same concept within a workplace, is that many people will come to you, and we can develop this perception that they should be there for all of eternity until they want to leave. And oftentimes people only fit for a certain amount of time, and then the mission changes. And so for us to be okay with the idea of recognizing they completed their tour, so to speak, back here, and there's no longer a good fit, and so we want this transition of moving on to help them get to a place where they can show up to work, be satisfied, it's a good fit for them, it feels good, great for them. So reinforce accountability and clarity with your team moving forward. You want to make sure that if that slipped while you were delaying addressing this issue with Bob or whoever it was, that's now reinforced and fixed, and that you're demonstrating empathy for him without belaboring it and moving on. The outcome of this usually is a stronger and more consistent culture that performs generally higher. How you resolve the loyalty versus performance dilemma with compassion and responsibility is part of what really defines your leadership and your culture in your company. But knowing when somebody needs to leave and taking that action is only the first step. Maintaining trust with your team is just as crucial as avoiding the kind of conflict that drives top talent away. So if you're wrestling with how to reward loyalty without giving away control, watch the video popping up now. I'll break down why giving equity might not deliver the results that you're hoping for and what you can do instead.